Hello and welcome to today's webinar. For technical assistance, please phone Redback support on 1-800-733-416. If you would like to listen to this webinar through your phone instead, please dial the number and passcode that is listed below. Today, the Australian Airports Association presents Regional Airport Master Planning by Hannah Stanley, PhD, Manager of Airport Planning at the Airport Group. Today's webinar will cover the following topics: overview of the AAA Regional Airport Master Planning Guidelines, typical characteristics of a regional airport master plan, a case study, Regional RPT Airport Master Plan and its key takeaways, case study, General Aviation Master Plan and its key takeaways, discussion of the value of consultation, and things to think about when producing a regional airport master plan. The opportunity to ask questions will also be provided. To ask Hannah a question, please use the dark blue hand icon on the top right of your screen. Questions will be answered throughout the webinar. Before we start, I would like to take the opportunity to thank Hannah for her participation today and to provide you with a few updates from the Australian Airports Association. The 2019 National Conference program is being released this week. Early bird registrations are open and will close on the 31st of July. All details are available online at www.airportsconference.asn.au. Airport Safety Week, taking place from Monday the 14th to Friday the 18th of October, the video has been released. Jump online to our website or YouTube page, check out all the exciting things taking place this year. Queensland and Northern Territory Division meetings are being held soon. Registrations are open, so don't miss out on registering. Queensland Division meeting will be on the 5th of June in Brisbane, and the Northern Territory Division meeting will be on the 3rd of July in Nullarbor. Without any further ado, let's begin the webinar.
All right, hi everyone. Thanks for the introduction and thanks everyone for joining me on this webinar today. I haven't done one of these before, so fingers crossed technology is on our side and everything goes according to plan. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to me throughout the presentation and I'll respond to them perhaps during or also at the end. And if there's any issues in hearing me, please also let me know. So just briefly to give everyone an idea of who we are at the Airport Group, if you're not aware, we operate under 4 key pillars, which you can see here: commercial advisory, research and stakeholder engagement, airport planning, and airspace and instrument flight procedures. We've been engaged recently across a range of projects, including ALAs all the way up to Brisbane Airport's master plan. And also, I'm aware that I haven't met everyone here on this webinar, so just to give you a face to put to my name, that's me there. I'm the Manager for Airport Planning and Stakeholder Engagement research aspects at the Airport Group, working in collaboration with our other teams. I have an undergraduate degree in Urban and Regional Planning and a PhD in International Airport Planning and Stakeholder Engagement. So I've been with the Airport Group for about 5.5 years and I've worked on a range of projects from regionals up to capital city airports. So now that introductions are out of the way, this is the overview of my presentation for today as was just described. So firstly, I'll go over a couple of strategies that you can adopt for regional airport master plans. I'll briefly go over the AAA guideline and a methodology that I would say we would typically adopt. I'll discuss the value of stakeholder engagement in airport master planning and just airport development generally. And I'll then provide a couple of case studies from master plans, so one for Albury Airport in New South Wales and one for Cairns Airport, looking at the General Aviation Precinct specifically. And I've then summarised a few key takeaways from the presentation. So firstly, into some strategies for regional airport master plans. As you would all be aware, the AAA has developed the guideline for regional airport master planning that they released, I think it was in 2014, which is great, and it really filled the void, I think, that was lacking when it came to guidance on regional airport master planning. And I think there's great value in developing a master plan with the elements that they've listed. So this slide here is just sort of the key headings from that guideline. So they have an introduction, sort of the overview, the purpose, methodology and structure, the background information, which provides the overview of the report, the current situation, a SWOT analysis, and some vision and objectives, and also the critical airport parameters. The other sort of half of the guidelines, if you like, is focused on what they refer to as the airport master plan. So that is all the land use plan, the facilities development plan, ground transport plan, environmental, heritage, airport safeguarding and implementation. So I'm sure that most of you are across the content of this guideline already, and as you know, there's a few that are plans or elements of the guideline that are outlined as optional, being the ground transport plan, the environmental management plan and the heritage management plan, which I think raises a very important discussion about developing a master plan which is appropriate for your airport. So not only these plans that the AAA have nominated as optional, but I think it's really important to consider all aspects of a master plan and what's appropriate for your airport operation. So I'll touch more on that a bit later. In terms of what I would say a typical methodology is that we adopt here at the airport group. Firstly, we start with a project inception. So that's the project inception meeting, which we also like to tie in a site visit to. Then followed by, after that, stakeholder engagement is one of the first things that we do. So this can ultimately draw out and run concurrently with other components of the master plan process, but we like to at least start to identify the strategy for engagement as soon as possible. Thirdly, the airport context is critical consideration and input for the master plan. So in this, I'm referring to the socio-economic context, the demographics, the major projects in the region, and so on. I also refer here to the legislation, so be it the CASA regulations or air services requirements, as well as other legislation such as state and local planning schemes. And being that most of regional airports are local government owned, it's very important that you understand the local planning scheme and the impacts that that can have on the airport and the master plan, the implementation of a master plan. Some further inputs that we have in our master plans that we develop is the airport overviews. So this is where we would describe the airport in the existing state and the most important pieces of infrastructure and facilities. So airside infrastructure would be things such as the runway, taxiways and aprons, as well as nav aids and so on. And the landside infrastructure and facilities are essentially the rest of the airport. So terminals, airport offices, car rental areas, car parks and so on. The forecast is the next element. They're integral to a master plan, and obviously depending on the operation of the airport, it would change the type of forecast required. Essentially, as we all know, they ultimately come down to RPT Passenger Forecast, RPT Aircraft Forecast, and Itinerant or GA Aircraft Forecast. And lastly, the determination of future requirements is a result of all the preceding steps, essentially. So very briefly, and I'm generalising here, the design aircraft will determine the airside infrastructure requirements, while the forecast will determine the landside infrastructure and facilities. Stakeholder desires and needs will also drive the landside infrastructure and facilities. So in terms of what I would call the land use planning content of a master plan, we typically include these three elements. So this area in particular really depends on your airport and the size and type of operation. So in summary, we develop land use precincts within an airport site and supporting land use guidelines within these. Consideration here must be given to the town planning scheme in developing these land use precincts, and if anything nominated, for example, would require an amendment to the town planning scheme, that should be flagged with the airport and with the planners at the council as soon as possible. The airport safeguarding elements may include ANF, OLS and PANS ops. So the inclusion of these would typically depend on any existing plans for these that might already be in place, or if anything notable has changed based on current plans. So for example, if the runway dimensions change, which would change the protection surfaces requirements, or an ANF that needs to be updated if it already exists based on the revised forecast. And lastly, the master plan drawing is really what all these preceding stages lead into. So based on the elements I've discussed, this drawing presents the required airfield and relevant protection areas, the land use precincts and key pieces of landside infrastructure and facilities. I'll provide a couple of examples of master plan drawings for Albury and Cairns Airport a bit later as well. The last element of a master plan that we typically develop is the implementation plan. So the stages are normally short, 0 to 5 years, medium, 6 to 10, long, 11 to 20, and sometimes also ultimate, so 20 plus years. We normally produce a master plan for regional airports which include high-level costings of key pieces of infrastructure in these stages as well. So for example, runway upgrades, taxiway apron, terminal footprint expansion. As I've outlined previously, and you can see on the slide here, I reiterate the point that the content of a master plan really does depend on the airport context. So for example, a master plan developed to the scale for an RPT airport would probably not be necessary for a GA-only airport. There's also opportunity to produce master plans for specific precincts of a large airport, which I'll show you with the Cairns Airport case study. So that's how there's a couple of strategies which you can adopt in developing a master plan for a regional airport. I guess what I said a couple of times, and I'll reiterate it, is that you should just make sure it fits the purpose for your airport. The AAA guidelines are a great template if you're looking for a starting point, and they could be followed the whole way through, or there could be some flexibility in terms of what you include depending on your airport size and operation. So a bit of a change of focus now. I'm just going to talk about stakeholder engagement in master planning. So I would argue that stakeholder engagement is not only important in master planning, but also in most airport development projects. So airports, by their nature, are complex pieces of transport infrastructure, impacting a wide range of internal and external stakeholders, as I'm sure you're all well aware, and they often carry competing needs, desires and interests. And stakeholders can significantly influence outcomes, so it's necessary for airport owners and operators to consider their stakeholders and effectively engage with them. And if you effectively engage with your stakeholders, it has a direct impact on your ability to gain what some people call a social license from your stakeholders. In terms of the value of stakeholder engagement, I would say that it's an integral component of airport master plans. It provides stakeholders an opportunity to have input into the master planning process. It gives you an opportunity to understand the stakeholders' needs and desires and also future demand for their operations. And it also gives you an opportunity to understand their expectations. So that is also, you can give the stakeholders an expectation from you as well as vice versa. And it provides an avenue for transparent communication between you and your stakeholders. Also, and importantly, it provides more accurate inputs for forecasting. It also, I would say, provides a level of ownership for your stakeholders with the master plan for the airport more broadly, especially when you consider that most airports in regional areas are essentially pieces of social infrastructure. I think this ownership that the community or airport tenants may take of the airport is really important. So asking the question of who should be engaged with, there's a few examples that I've listed here, but I think the process really depends on your airport, your stakeholders and the project. Essentially though, you can group stakeholders into internal and external stakeholders, and within those a few subgroups. So internal stakeholders, for example, would be those that own and operate the airport essentially. So you've got airport management, perhaps even AROs or staff at the airport. You've got airport, the owners, so whether it's the council, engagement with the councillors, or if you are privatised with the shareholders. Council leadership and management, so that's perhaps the manager for commercial operations or property at the council, which often sits over the airport, and so on. With regards to external stakeholders, these are those that are outside the airport owner and operator. So you've got the airport tenants and users. The airlines are obviously a critical stakeholder if you've got RPT operations. If you don't have RPT operations, then the GA users would be, and the users of the airport are just as critical. The community is a very important stakeholder, and local, state and federal government are clearly important stakeholders in terms of land use planning and also regulatory bodies. There are also other stakeholders to consider externally, so that industry bodies such as tourism agencies or resource sector representatives, depending on the economic drivers in the region that your airport's operating in. So what's the best method of engagement? Again, I'm sort of harping on the point that it really depends on your airport, but I think this is particularly true for engagement. So for your internal stakeholders, you might find it most suitable to have one-on-one meetings, perhaps to have workshops with, for example, management at the airport, or perhaps you will present to council and the councillors. Community stakeholders, you could do surveys, and these could be online or in person, or may include distribution via a website, for example, or they could be an interception survey at the terminal to understand the passengers. There's also social media that you can obviously utilise, public information forums, information stands at, say, shopping centres, and so on. With regards to engagement with airport users, there's one-on-one meetings, workshops, surveys, etc., and other external stakeholders could be teleconferences. Often the external stakeholders aren't based where your airport is, so teleconferences, whether it's one-on-one or in a group, are a really effective way of engaging with these stakeholders. But in any means, I think having a clear idea of what you hope to achieve from your project, you can define a clear strategy for engagement. And it's important to make the most of it. So you will be getting a lot of very valuable data from your stakeholders, and there's several ways that you can make the most of it. Firstly, I would say everything needs to be recorded, so not only the arrangement of the engagement, but also the discussions that you have with your stakeholders. So you may wish to refer to the outcomes later on, or someone else may wish to read the engagement notes. So the clearer and the more precise that you make this recording, I think the better. The outcomes of engagement, they should be reviewed and analysed. So they may be qualitative in nature, so interviews or workshops, or they might be quantitative, so surveys and numbers and figures. So you could analyse those using descriptive statistics, or if it's interviews or one-on-one data, you could use thematic analysis, which is essentially just finding themes within the content and also identifying any correlations. The feedback gathered during engagement in the master plan may not only relate to the master plan, but might be operational in nature. So for example, a tenant may have constraints with car parking for their staff, say. And although this may not be directly useful for a master plan input, it's really valuable information nonetheless, and it should be collated and fed back to the right person at the airport. Another consideration is whether regular engagement or additional engagement is required with stakeholders. So, for example, you might identify as part of your engagement process there's a reason that you need to have an ongoing dialogue with a stakeholder or stakeholder group, or you may identify a group of stakeholders that you think you should develop a regular working group with them. The moral of the story is don't underestimate stakeholder engagement, and if it's done well and genuinely, that I think you and your stakeholders will find really a lot of value in it. So just moving on now to Albury Airport as a case study to go through. So Albury Airport, we completed a master plan wrapped up in the middle of 2018. You can see the airport site here for those that aren't familiar. So just the little overview of Albury and Albury Airport. The catchment size of the region is about 200,000. For those that aren't aware, Albury sits pretty much on the border with Victoria, and the population of Albury and its neighbouring city, Wodonga, is about 92,000. It's about 5k from Albury city centre. 112 hectare site. It's a towered airport, and at the time that we did the master plan, it had up to 180 flights a week. So you can see the airlines there. Obviously, Jetco isn't around anymore, but they were at the time. And there's also significant aeromedical and aerial firefighting operations which happen out of Albury Airport. Just a quick snapshot here of the historic movements at the airport and the historic passenger and aircraft movements. And here's our methodology at a very high level. So we commenced the project with a project inception meeting, did a desktop review of all the data and information that was made available and everything else that we thought that would research online, such as the planning schemes and those sorts of things. Stakeholder engagement, we started right at the start. That carried on throughout the whole process. RPT, GA and air freight forecasts were produced. There was a number of supporting reports that were produced as part of this master plan. So that was a terminal analysis, car parking, freight forecasting, and the report supporting the forecast. We finalised the master plan, and then that was presented to Albury City Council. And importantly, I should note here also that it went out to public comment for a period of time. It was made available online and also from the council in a physical copy for the community to make submissions on as a draft. So you can find the finalised version of the master plan on the Albury City Council website if you wanted to have a look. In terms of stakeholder engagement, there was quite extensive engagement undertaken as part of this project. We engaged with all the airlines, with the council, with the City of Wodonga, Air Services, Fire and Rescue New South Wales, flight schools, GA users, ground transport operators, leaseholders, car rental companies, and the community. The types of engagement or the methods of engagement that we adopted were quite varied. So there was quite a lot of one-on-one engagement, particularly with airport tenants. There was also an online survey for airport tenants. There was a survey done for the community during the master plan process, so they didn't only have feedback opportunity while it was a draft, there was also input into the master plan from the community. So we attended an airport open day and had a stall there asking people to complete our online survey, and then was also made available on Albury City Council platforms. We had several teleconferences with stakeholders, and we had a number of workshops with the council's project team, and then finally the presentation to council. The RPT Passenger Forecast was produced, which you can see here. I'll just quickly brush over these. Like I said before, they're a very important part of the master plan process, but don't have time to go too much into them. So there's also an RPT Movement Forecast done, as you can see, and also GA Forecast. So after all those preceding steps, there were a few future development considerations that came up as important to consider in developing the master plan. The first one was a terminal area assessment. So that was done based on a forecast busy hour for the airport, based on the forecast passenger projections, and we determined that the area of the terminal expansion project, which was under construction when we were doing the master plan, was going to be sufficient moving forward. We also did a detailed assessment of the car parking. So we identified the uses and the different areas of car parking that Albury Airport has and the peak periods, and found that the secure car park would reach its capacity in about 10 years from the time that we wrote the master plan, and then the general car park not long after that. We produced an air freight forecast, which was essentially a capacity and a high-level throughput forecast and determined that the current area and the operations for air freight was sufficient moving forward. It was identified that the airport site is pretty constrained. So I don't know if you would have noticed in the aerial image, or you'll see in the master plan drawing, that there's development around most sides of the airport. And as a result of that, the runway is constrained to a width of 30 metres. So we also identified there's some commercial development opportunities, or at least sites for commercial development, and also for emergency services expansion. So here is the master plan drawing. After all those preceding stages, this is ultimately what the outcome is. This drawing that I'm showing you now shows the ultimate airfield expansion, so 20 plus years. I'll just provide a few comments on this, but as I mentioned, you can have a closer look on the Albury City Council website. I'm not sure how big everyone's screens are, but you'll see there's a sort of light blue colour of land that's up towards runway 25, and that there, whilst you can see it's outside of the airport site, we incorporated that within the master plan because it's part of an adjoining development that the council has planned, and it integrates into the airport. So this plan assumes a full-length parallel taxiway, and the RPT apron has been expanded to accommodate up to 7 aircraft, including 3 717 size. The significant area for expansion of aprons has been allowed for down towards runway 7, so that's for emergency services nominally, so both aeromedical and aerial firefighting operations. And overall, there's 5 key precincts for land uses, and within the master plan documents, there's guidelines for land uses within these precincts. As part of the master plan for Albury, we also produced an implementation plan. So what I'm showing here is just a snippet from the short-term phase of the implementation plan. I don't intend for you to read it in detail, but I just wanted to provide an insight into how we would typically produce implementation plans when you're trying to make them as concise and clear as possible. And in this case, you'll see that there's actions, if you like, for each precinct, as well as what we call general actions, which relate to updating or producing reports, engagement, route development, feasibility analysis, and so on. And supporting these implementation plan points for key pieces of infrastructure such as aprons or taxiways, high-level costings have also been provided within the master plan. So just a few takeaways for Albury Airport Master Plan. As part of the process, the engagement really contributed significantly. It also set realistic expectations within the community, I believe, and identified opportunities for development in the future, such as the emergency services operations. We also, as part of the process, identified commercial development opportunities, strategies for accommodating airport growth within a constrained site were also developed. The implementation plan, provides a detailed but flexible guide for the next 20 years of development. And this master plan project incorporated detailed analysis of the elements that I mentioned earlier, so car parking, terminal, freight, which each provided a lot of value in developing the result, which is a holistic and very detailed master plan report for Albury City Council. Just moving on now to a few key takeaways, essentially summarising the whole presentation. Feel free to ask me questions now or save them to the end, whatever's easiest. So I've just listed a few things here that I think are really important to remember for regional airport master planning. This is not a be-all and end-all list, obviously, but just some key things to think about. So the local planning scheme, we believe, should always at least acknowledge the master plan, particularly with regard to the commercial potential of the airport, the land use planning regulations and what's allowed or not allowed on the site. Airport safeguarding is critical to being incorporated or acknowledged into the planning scheme, so that's the OLS and potentially PANTOPS and the ANF. And also the operational requirements should be acknowledged within the planning scheme. This is all essentially coming back to safeguarding the airport for the long term and recognising that within the legislative land use planning guidelines. So in terms of stakeholder engagement, a couple of takeaways is to determine who your stakeholders are, engage early in the planning process and consider the best means of engagement for each of your stakeholders. So I've just got a question here about stakeholder engagement, commenting on the need to engage adjoining landowners and nearby airports at early stages. Yes, so okay, so in terms of engaging with adjoining landowners, I think that's very important. And if you've got land abutting the airport particularly, it's important to engage with them in terms of airport safeguarding and noise. And I would say that the earlier you engage, the better. And I think in terms of adjoining land uses, it's good to set expectations for them, and also they have expectations for you, and just to make sure that you're on the same page and you open a transparent line of communication. Adjoining land uses potentially have the most impact on the airport, so I think that's a very important point. And also nearby airports, if you've got airports that are competitors within your region in terms of RPT operations, if they're within the same council area, I guess it makes it a lot more straightforward to engage with them or their managers. If they're in a different council area, I think collaboration and coordination is always better in terms of competition for RPT. That's perhaps a discussion that can also be had with the airlines if there's nearby airports. And the question talks about at early stages. And again, I reiterate the point that I think the earlier you can engage, the better. And I don't think you should limit stakeholder engagement just to a master plan process. I think that it should be something that you consider even putting some structure around so that it's part of your day-to-day operations. I think it can mitigate some conflicts or challenges that you might have along the way. So just a couple more key takeaways. This is my last slide. So I'd like to say that you should be clear about what you want to achieve from the master plan process. So every master plan is different depending on what you want as an operator, or what the council wants, or what the community needs from an airport. So the clearer you are about that, the more defined you can be moving forward into the engagement and the data collection process. I would say that you should review and update your master plan regularly. So as you all know, unlike the capital city airports, or the ones under the airports, actually don't have a requirement to update it, but I think every 5 to 10 years, perhaps leaning towards 10 years for the smaller airports, is a good period of time to update your master plan, or when major changes occur. So as I mentioned earlier, JetGo, by way of example, JetGo isn't offering services anymore into the region, so if that was your only airline, perhaps it's a good time to update your master plan or other strategies such as route development. But another change that might occur is if you've got a flying school, for example, that are creating a lot of operations and they leave the airport, or you have a resource sector company wanting to talk to you. I think it's just important to be flexible in terms of when you update it, because it won't necessarily be every 10 years on the dot that you need an update. Develop a master plan that is fit for purpose and pragmatic. So that's something that we try and do here at the Airport Group as best as we can. We really believe in pragmatic work and master plans, so don't obviously be ambitious, but also recognise your context. And develop a master plan that's flexible, which allows a response to change in internal and external context. So that could be factors that you can't influence, or perhaps it's factors within your own council. And it's important that your master plan is flexible and doesn't lock you in. They are a 20-year, typically a 15 or 20-year planning period, so it's a long time. So the more flexible that you can make it, whilst also providing strategic guidance, the better. So that's it from me, unless there's any questions from anyone. I think I answered one already, but if there's anything else anyone would like to ask, please go ahead. Otherwise, I think that probably concludes the webinar.
Would you still like to wait another minute or so? Or?
Yeah, you could do that, yep. I've just got a couple of comments, I'll just respond. You're welcome. I'm glad that you found it helpful. Feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. If you don't want to ask them on here, I'm happy for you to send me an email or give me a call on my mobile, which is on the screen there, if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about.
Well, it seems like we don't have any further questions. So thank you, Hannah, for your informative presentation, and thank you to everyone for participating in today's session. We ask that you now take a moment to complete a short survey that you will see on the right-hand side of your screen. Please ensure you hit the orange submit button once you have completed all the questions. This webinar will be made available to members via the Airport Professional Webinar page in the coming week. We encourage you to provide feedback on any other topics that you would like to see covered by emailing events@airports.asn.au. And the next AAA webinar presenter will be Darren Angelo from CASA. The link to register will be distributed by Redback shortly, and details will also be released in Airport Alert. If you would like additional information, please email the AAA events team on events@airports.asn.au. Today's webinar recording will be available in the Airport Alert and emailed to everyone directly once available. Have a wonderful afternoon.